Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 11 of Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Today specifically we're going to be focusing on pathogens and parasites, and how they've become the things that have plagued the human society for so long. Chapter 11, The Lethal Gift of Livestock. We have now traced how food production arose from few centers and how it spread at unequal rates from where to other areas. Those geographic differences constitute important ultimate answers to Yali's question about why different peoples ended up with disparate degrees of power and affluence. Basically, the idea here is throughout human history, we're talking about how some people became more affluent as to others and what led to it, and that's the overall theme of the book. But while food production is a primary aspect, another huge important part of the story is actually germs. That guns, germs, and steel is what we're talking about here when we're talking about pathogens as well as parasites. As we'll see in this chapter, one of the biggest factors when it came to the settling of the New World that pathogens played in the conquering of the land. Instead of one part of the explanation for farmer power lies in much denser populations that food production could support. 10 naked farmers could certainly have an advantage over one naked hunter-gatherer in a fight. The other part is that neither farmers nor hunter-gatherers are naked, at least not figuratively. Farmers tend to breathe out nastier germs, to own better weapons and armor, and own more powerful technology in general, and to live under centralized governments with literate elites better able to wage wars of conquest. When we dig down to the differences between cultures, farmers have a significant advantage, not in necessarily man-to-man strength, but rather how much farming has allowed denser organization of cultures. And we've seen this in previous videos that I've done on this book. I just wanted to touch on this here. Some of us adults, and even more of our children, pick up infectious diseases from our pets. Usually they remain no more than a nuisance, but in a few cases have evolved into something more serious. The major killers of humanity throughout our recent history, smallpox, flu, tuberculosis, malaria, plague, measles, and cholera, are infectious diseases that have evolved from diseases of animals, even though most of the microbes responsible for their own epidemic illnesses are paradoxically now almost confined to humans. The idea here is that it's our interaction with animals that have caused a lot of the diseases that have plagued our society. But the idea here is that the animals have certain pathogens that they carry that may or may not affect them adversely, but have serious effects on how they affect us humans. Because diseases have been the biggest killers of people, they've also been decisive shapers of history. Until World War II, more victims of war died from waterborne microbes than battle wounds. All of those military histories glorifying great generals, oversimplifying the ego, deflating the truth. The winners of past wars were not always the armies with the best generals and weapons, but were often merely those bearing the nastiest germs to transmit to their enemies. If you read reports about early medieval warfare, one of the biggest factors when it comes to how the battle plays out is actually coming down to a number of different diseases that can affect large groups of people in a given area. For instance, it wasn't uncommon for dysentery to have a massive effect on an army, almost obliterating the strength of it to the point where the other side could come in and destroy it without so much of an issue. That's the basic idea that they're talking about here. This is that at the end of the day, while generals have played a huge part in how the battle plays out, one of the biggest factors that comes to the winning of the war actually comes down to how well they are able to maintain cleanliness within the camps. And we'll get into why this is important a little bit later. But the goal here is that we're actually trying to look at a very outside perspective of how the battles are actually won and what's the end result of those wars. Biggest factor that we need to make sure that we're keeping in mind for our books is that sometimes the factors come down to how much cleaner a group of people are compared to another. This could be a cultural thing, this could be a religious thing, this could have any number of factors in our stories that we can use to help guide the path of the outcome we want to see. Or we want to see our characters go through tough times. So one of the great ways that we can show them dealing with an unexpected hurdle is having diseases pop up and have them deal with those catastrophic issues. The grimiest examples of germs' role in history came from European conquest of the Americas that began with Columbus's voyage in 1492. Numerous as were the Native American victims of the murderous Spanish conquistadors, they were far more outnumbered by the victims of the murderous Spanish microbes. Why was the exchange of nasty germs between the Americas and Europe so unequal? Why didn't Native American diseases instead decimate the Spanish invaders, spread back to Europe, and wipe out 90% of Europe's population? These are all factors when it comes to how we see history. It wasn't like the Europeans came and wiped out everybody by the sword, but rather the vast majority, nearly all the native population was wiped out because of diseases that Columbus had brought over with him, as in addition to other Spanish people coming over and it spreading that way. Thus, the questions of animal origins of human diseases lie behind the broadest pattern of human history, and behind some of the most important issues in human health today. Think AIDS, an explosively spreading human disease that appears to have evolved from a virus resident in wild African monkeys. Even today, we are still seeing the after effects of the human-to-animal relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that all of those are debased, but just the fact that we have animals around us means that it is easy to receive those pathogens that we get from the animals that we are spending time with. If you are spending a fair amount of time with a specific animal, more likely you are actually going to receive the diseases that that particular animal has. A side note is that not all of that is a bad thing. For instance, the sickness of smallpox, which was a disaster for most of the world, actually had a relatively benign cousin that actually helped save a lot of people. This cousin was called cowpox. Naturally, we're disposed to think about diseases just from our own point of view. What can we do to save ourselves and kill the microbes? Let's stomp out the scoundrels, and never mind what their motives are. In life in general, though, one has to understand the enemy in order to beat him. That's especially true in medicine. One of the things that they talk about here is the fact that you have situations where you try to understand why things go the way they go. But we need to make sure that we're actually seeing it from the proper perspective and why things play out the way they play out. Well, we don't necessarily believe that microbes have a conscious in their decision making. They have certain patterns of behavior that we could actually predict pretty well. The most effortless way a germ can spread is by just waiting to be transmitted passively to the next victim. That's the strategy practiced by microbes that wait for the one host to be eaten by the next host. For instance, Salmonella bacteria, which we contact by eating already affected eggs or meat. These are just one of the cases where you have a particular disease that is actually brought about by eating the already infected eggs or meat. There are other ones, such as tapeworms, a parasite that requires that pork be eaten that has not been cooked properly. These are very different ways of getting the same way. Some microbes don't wait for the old host to die and get eaten, but instead hitchhike on the saliva of an insect that bites the old host and flies off to find a new host. The free ride may be provided by mosquitoes, fleas, lice, tsetse flies that spread malaria, plague, typhus, or sleeping sickness, respectively. One of the biggest factors that prevented southward movement in Africa actually had to do with malaria and the tsetse flies. Both were carried in a way that were not understood, but caused severe problems for those who are not used to those types of diseases. While in the Americas, the diseases from the Old World to the New World decimated the New Worlders, the Africa diseases prevented most of the early expansion and colonization efforts by Europe's into the South. Similarly, the cholera bacterium induces in its victim a massive diarrhea that delivers bacteria into the water supplies of potential new victims, while the virus responsible for Korean hemorrhagic fever broadcasts itself on the urine of mice. For modification of a host behavior, nothing matches rabies virus, which not only gets into the saliva of an infected dog, but also drives the dog into a frenzy of biting and thus infecting many new victims. There are other examples of a pathogen that causes a change in behavior. This is not just seen in microbes, we also see this in fungus. So for instance, there's a type of fungus that actually infects certain types of ants. This is the basis of the video game series Last of Us, where there was a jump from ants to humans for this fungus that caused the outbreak. There are other examples that we could mention. Thus, from our point of view, genital sores, diarrhea, and coughing were symptoms of disease. From a germ's point of view, they are clever evolutionary strategies to broadcast the germ. That's why it's in the germ's interest to make us sick. But why should a germ evolve the apparent self-defeating strategy of killing its host? From the germ's perspective, that is just an unintended byproduct, fat consolation to us, of host symptoms promoting efficient transmission of microbes. Yes, an untreated cholera patient may eventually die from producing diarrheal fluid at a rate of several gallons per day. At least for a while though, as long as the patient is still alive, the cholera bacterium profits from being massively broadcast into the water supply of its next victims, provided that each victim thereby infects on the average more than one new victim. The bacterium will spread even though the first host happens to die. Another way that we can see the bacteria that we're discussing here is the same way we see parasites. While parasites are multi-celled organisms, we could have the same perspective when it comes to germs, which tend to be single cell. Even viruses require a host to develop and survive and to reproduce off of. That is the case in all of these issues. Why I mentioned talking about parasites. We want to make sure that when we are talking about this type of sicknesses, that we're talking not necessarily something that is over the top or disgusting for its disgusting sake, but having a understanding of how patterns of behavior can produce a specific outcome. One common response of ours to infection is to develop a fever. Again, we're considering fever as a symptom of the disease, as if it developed inevitably without serving any function. But regulation of body temperature is under our genetic control and doesn't just happen by accident. A few microbes are more sensitive to heat than our own bodies are. By raising our body temperature, we are in effect trying to bake the germs to death before we get baked ourselves. The idea here is that our body has natural reactions to these diseases. This is why we cook food. Our body tries to bake the disease and kill and make them very inhospitable to these diseases. That doesn't always necessarily work, but our body is designed to do this to protect ourselves. That doesn't mean that it doesn't go overboard, but there are times where you need to take us up to the point of near death in order to actually survive. As we all know from experience, there are some illnesses, such as flu and common cold, which our resistance is only temporary. We can eventually contract the illness again against other illnesses, though, including measles, mumps, rubella, pertussis, and the now defeated smallpox. Our antibodies stimulated by one infection confer lifelong immunity. This is what I was talking about earlier with cowpox. When we talk about smallpox, there was actually a cousin disease called cowpox, where they actually found that people who had cowpox actually didn't suffer from smallpox, what ended up becoming vaccination. Now, this is in Europe, but they discovered the same type of concept in the East, in China, where they would actually take the crushed up portions of the disease and actually blow it into somebody's nose. That would cause the same effect as vaccination, though it didn't always work as well as they'd like. That's the principle of vaccination, to stimulate our antibody production without having our go through the actual experience of the disease by inoculating us with dead or weakened strain of the microbe. This is what I was talking about when I was mentioning China. They had a crushed up version of the sickness based off from the pus or the scabs of the disease and actually blew it into the nose of the person to vaccinate them against the disease so that they got a lesser form of it and actually survived. This is why when we get the flu vaccine, we feel kind of crappy right after, but then we tend to not get that particular strain this year. That's why you get the flu vaccination every year, is because it goes through changes. But microbes evolve to feed on the nutrients within our own bodies, and they don't have wings to let them reach a new victim's body once the original victim is dead or resistant. Hence, many germs have had to evolve tricks to let them spread between potential victims, and many of those tricks are what we experience as symptoms of disease. The greatest single epidemic in human history is the one of influenza that killed 21 million people at the end of the First World War. The Black Death, called the bubonic plague, killed 1/4 of Europe's population between 1346 and 1352, which death tolls ranging up 70% in some cities. The influenza that's actually mentioned here is actually called the Spanish flu, just as a side note. But when we're talking about diseases that actually are catastrophic, these are the two that are actually coming to people's mind. When we actually see the Black Death, that's actually a bacterial one rather than a virus, where the influenza is a virus. So if we had the technology, we could have actually prevented the Black Death from actually having the same catastrophic injury on the world population, particularly in the side of Europe, as we do any other diseases that are bacterial based. First, they spread quickly and efficiently from an infected person to a nearby healthy person, with the result that the whole population gets exposed within a short time. Second, they are acute illnesses. Within a short time, you will either die or recover completely. Third, the fortunate ones of us who do recover develop antibodies that leave us immune to recurrence of this disease for a long term, and possibly for the rest of our lives. Finally, these diseases tend to be restricted to humans, the microbes causing them tend not to live in the soil or other animals. All 4 of these traits apply to what Americans think as the familiar acute epidemic diseases of childhood, including measles, rubella, mumps, pertussis, and smallpox. The pandemic of 2020 could also be considered part of this. Still, other infections of small human populations are chronic diseases such as leprosy and yaws. Since the disease may take a very long time to kill its victim, the victim remains alive as a reservoir of microbes to infect other members of the tribelet. This is why there was always a separation of diseases such as leprosy. In the Bible, it was required by the law to actually declare yourself as being leprous. So if you had leprosy, you actually had to be segregated from everybody else. This prevented the leprosy from spreading to healthy individuals. Why did the rise of agriculture launch the evolution of our crowd infectious diseases? One reason just mentioned is that agriculture sustains a much higher human densities than does the hunting-gathering lifestyle, on average 10 to 100 times higher. When we're talking about the development of diseases, each time you have diseases that move from person to person, they change ever so slightly. Sometimes they change in such a way that actually negates the vaccination that we have. Like I mentioned earlier about having the flu vaccine every year. As the disease rolls through a population, it actually changes from the first person to the last person that has it, so that by the point that first person is actually susceptible to that same disease that the last person has. It's a rolling adaptation that these diseases are having. So when you have a much higher population, that change is a lot higher, and therefore will have a massive effect on society as a whole. There's a part of the story where they actually talk about certain countries or certain areas, because they have such a small population, they actually didn't have enough of a population to sustain a disease, where the disease rolled through the whole of the population and actually died out. But when the population becomes bigger, it actually becomes sustainable for that disease to just roll constantly through that particular group. Thus, when the human population became sufficiently large and concentrated, we reached the stage of our history in which we could at last evolve and sustain crowd diseases confined to our own species. But that conclusion presents a paradox. Such diseases could never have existed before then. Instead, they had to evolve as new diseases. Where did these new diseases evolve from? Evidence has recently been emerging from molecular studies of the diseases causing microbes themselves. For many of the microbes responsible for our own unique diseases, molecular biologists can now identify the microbes' closest relatives. These also prove to be agents of crowd infectious diseases, but ones confined to various species of our domestic animals and pets. Here we can see that we're talking about, while we think them as being our own diseases, pretty much all the diseases that we see today are actually diseases that are coming from the domestic animals or pets. There's a lot that we get from animals around us that we actually didn't develop on our own. The importance of lethal microbes in human history is well illustrated by Europeans' conquest and depopulation of the New World. Far more Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefield from Eurasians' guns and swords. For instance, in 1519, Cortez landed on the coast of Mexico with 600 Spaniards to conquer the fiercely militaristic Aztec Empire with a population of many millions. That Cortez reached the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, escaped with the loss of only 2/3 of his force, and managed to fight his way back to the coast demonstrates both Spanish military advantages and initial naivete of the Aztecs. What gave the Spaniards a decisive advantage was the smallpox, which reached Mexico in 1520 with one infected slave arriving from Spanish Cuba. The resulting epidemic proceeded to kill nearly half of the Aztecs, including Emperor Quetzalcoatl. Aztec survivors were demoralized by the mysterious illness that killed Indians and spared Spaniards, as if advertising the Spaniards' invincibility. By 1618, Mexico's initial population of 20 million had plummeted to about 1.6 million. For the New World as a whole, the Indian population decline in the century or two following Columbus's arrival is estimated to have been as large as 95%. Basically, the idea is that before the Native Americans even saw a white person, they could have been wiped out by the diseases that the white person had brought. So here's some story ideas that we can build off of what we learned about today. Basically, if you could have a culture that is dominant but ends up becoming destroyed by a disease, such ideas we've seen in Lord of the Rings, where the Númenóreans got hit by a plague and actually wiped out the Northern Kingdom. Now, there's a number of different movies that actually use this idea for themselves. I have already mentioned a video game series called Last of Us, which was made into a TV series later. But there are other ones we could mention here. World War Z, 28 Days Later. These are more zombie as opposed to pandemic or diseases. But you also have 12 Monkeys starring Bruce Willis, where that is a movie about a world-decimating disease that causes part of the end of the world. I Am Legend is another disease movie where they actually created a disease to help them fight other diseases, and it actually turned back on them and actually destroyed the world. Another one is called The Happening, starring Mark Wahlberg. Now, this is an M. Night Shyamalan movie that actually is causing that the behavior change that we had mentioned earlier with rabies, but the behavior change was actually ending oneself in various different ways. Now, obviously, the movie didn't do well. So the idea of using these ideas doesn't mean you're actually going to have a good story, because these are just parts of the story that you can put in to help create a understanding and a depth to the characters. So in the end, there are a number of different ways that we can take a look at pandemics, diseases, and parasites to tell a different story than we typically see them. One of the things that we also need to keep in mind is that what are the consequences of the pandemic? For us, after the 2020 pandemic, there was some hardships. But if we take a look at other situations where we're talking about a vast population being wiped out by diseases, what does that world look like? Does that world have any hope? Is there any chance of building back what they had beforehand? Or are they just trying to survive? Are they just trying to prevent themselves from being destroyed? What does that do to a person's psyche? What does that do to a person's understanding of reality when they live their whole life having an expectation of things, but then when the world gets ultimately wiped out or nearly wiped out, what does that look like for the people going through that and who survive? Yes, it's easy to show the tragedy of the deaths, but when we're talking about the people who survive, this is where we can actually have a really good story. 9 times out of 10, when we're talking about diseases, we always try to focus on the disease itself. But I see that you can use the diseases as a mode to tell the story, where the disease is actually just how the story starts. Whereas if we focus on the characters surviving through that situation, we can actually create a pretty compelling story. All right, that's all I had for today. As always, I will link all the resources I use in the description. I only use a little bit of what I actually talk about from the chapter, so please take a look for yourself. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I